Good morning and welcome to Salem Lutheran Church and School. It's our Tuesday morning Bible study. I don't know if your phones are going off at home, but we are in the midst of what seems to be an emergency crisis here at Salem. But rest assured, we are okay, and we are ready to begin our Tuesday morning Bible study on the miracles of Jesus. We are continuing our series on the miracles of Jesus, and today we will be taking a look at Jesus giving sight to a blind man. This account coming to us from St. Mark chapter 8. If you are joining us online, we welcome you. Obviously, welcome to those of you who are in person and braving all of the emergency warnings to be here. My name is Vicar Brett Jones, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. If you are joining us online, please make sure you say hello to your Salem family and friends, as that increases our metrics and gives us a chance to make sure that we get in touch with you as well. As we continue along today, if you have any questions, if you're here, please raise your hand or just shout at me. Please don't get out your pea shooter or anything if you have a question. There's been worse. If you're online, please go ahead and type the question into the chat box on Facebook, and Pastor Wayne Hebner is up there in the balcony along with our videographer, Mr. John Whitmere, and they will relay the question down here, and to which I will attempt to answer it, and maybe Pastor will bail me out, maybe not. We'll see how it goes. All right? So, let's get started today. Let's take a look at the top of your study guide under the focus statement. At the end of a lesson, the teacher asks if there are any questions. A student raises his hand and asks the simplest of questions. He clearly hadn't paid attention. With a sigh, the teacher answers, thinking, "Don't you get it? I've explained it over and over again, and still you don't seem to understand. What will it take for you to learn?" This is written by someone who either has never spent any time in a middle school classroom or spent too much time in a middle school classroom. That's probably one of those things that you may think but probably don't want to say to your students. But we've all been like that at some time, right? And we've all been in either position. If you have a son or daughter or niece or nephew, or you've been a teacher on a professional or a volunteer basis, maybe you've experienced this feeling. So let's take a look at that first question. Why are some lessons hard for us to learn? And this is one of those things that just seems incredibly simple, but if you start looking at it, becomes incredibly complicated. I know many of you who are sitting here have taught in either a professional or a volunteer basis, and you get to know this stuff, right? When I was going through college to get my teaching license, one of the things that they emphasized upon all of us was this concept of the zone of proximal development, which is a fancy term that just means, as a teacher, you need to suss out the difference between what a student can do on their own versus what they can do with help versus what they will be unable to do even with assistance. And that zone in the middle where they can do it with help is called the zone of proximal development. So if you are teaching, you get an idea for where your kids are, and you don't want to make the lesson too easy so that they're not actually learning anything, nor do you want to make it too hard so that they just sit there in their desks confused and it's not even their fault. So this is something that even if you've never learned the technical term, if you've ever taught something to your kid or to a student, you just do this on a natural level, right? You kind of figure out, well, yes, Art's like, hopefully. Yes, hopefully you kind of figure out where your kids are, and that's where you want to go reach to them. It could be that the teacher is not presenting the material in an engaging manner, which is not to say that as a teacher you want to be up here in a clown suit making everything entertainment value, but there is certainly value in being engaging and talking to your kids in a manner in which they can respond. Maybe the teacher can't maintain control of the classroom. Maybe they are maybe they are too meek to actually tell someone to sit down and do their work. Maybe the kids are out of control all the time. Maybe there's a student that has some sort of learning challenge that you have to overcome. Maybe they have a learning disability, or maybe they're just lacking in background knowledge. This can happen when a student transfers in. Suddenly, all of the things that you've assumed with your previous kids because you've taught them, now you've got kids that don't have that, and they need to be brought back up to speed. This would happen when I was teaching in Green Bay quite a bit, because I taught a combined 7th and 8th grade classroom. So there would be some times where we'd be teaching 8th grade, and we'd have a transfer in from someone in 8th grade, and I'd reference something that we had done the previous year, and the kids, thankfully, the kid would raise their hand and say, "Mr. Jones, we didn't cover that." It's like, "Oh yes, I'm sorry, we didn't. You weren't here for that." So we had to go back and reteach it. And finally, it could just be that the students are completely disengaged. They don't care. Or they're just not going to figure it out. All of these things, and this is only like kind of scratching the surface of why a lesson could go wrong, right? I mean, anytime you've taught anything to anyone, there are just innumerable things that can happen in a room. Probably the most exciting was I had a gang fight break out in my classroom 2 weeks into my first year of teaching. That was kind of had wondered what I got myself into at that point. But you never know what's going to happen. So if we take a look at what the Leader Guide says, there are many reasons why some lessons are hard to learn. Perhaps, like this student, we fail to pay attention. Sometimes the lesson is difficult. Perhaps what we're learning is different than what we had always thought to be true. And we may not just be interested in the lesson. And this sort of thing that the focus statement where the teacher says, "Don't you get it? Don't you get it?" I mean, that's a rhetorical question, right? The student obviously isn't going to say, "No, I don't get it." Okay, but that while it may seem to be sort of a ridiculous example, is going to come into play as we read the account for today. So if you take a look at the focus question number 2, how can a good teacher help overcome obstacles to learning? Out of those 5 things that I listed, 3 are under the teacher's control, to making sure that the lesson is an appropriate level, to making sure that you have maintained control of the classroom, and to make sure that you're not like what's his name at the beginning of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where he's just, "And in the Revolutionary War," and so on and so forth. Right, Bueller. Okay, so you make sure that you're at least doing it in an engaging manner. Now, all of us who have taught, whether it's just in a family context, in a professional context, on a volunteer context, there have been times where you don't get it right. Okay, where either you failed to make the lesson appropriate for the kids, something happens in the classroom, you didn't account for some sort of background knowledge or what have you, because we're not perfect, right? And Jesus was the perfect teacher. He lived a life without sin, and yet there are times where his disciples still just don't get it. And that's going to be the case today in our account from Mark. So, before we move into the informed questions, are there anyone here have a question, or anyone online have a question or a comment? Take a sip of coffee. Okay, then let's move on to the informed section. If you take a look at your study guide, you will see this little blurb on the beginning. The Bible study seems to join together several unrelated stories. The healing itself is found in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. However, the surrounding verses form an integral part of this story. They show a second miracle. Jesus opened not only the eyes of the blind man, but also the eyes of his disciples. And this is one of those cases where you heard that expression, the sum is greater than its parts. And that is going to be true of our of what we're going to be covering today. That taken individually, these little chunks of Scripture can seem like they don't matter that much, but when you put it together, you'll come out with a common theme. So let's begin by reading Mark chapter 8, verses 17 through 21. If you're in person, it should be on the yellow handout. If you are online, we're going to be using the New International Version from 1984. That's what's going to be read here. And if you have a different version of your Bible, it may be the words may be a little bit different sometimes, but that is just fine. You will be all right. So let's read these 4 verses. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" Now, it helps to kind of remember the context in which this is happening, because the disciples were in kind of a moment of panic because they had left and started on a journey but forgotten the bread, which, it's not like you can just pop through the McDonald's drive-in and make a go of it. So they're all in a panic. What are we going to do? We forgot to bring food. And Jesus just seems to be a little bit incredulous and seems like this teacher in the first example. Do you not understand? Just like, come on, you guys. We've been through this before, right? When have we been through something like this before? We've got a number of accounts where Jesus feeds. The feeding of the 5,000. This is told to us across the three synoptic gospels, where Jesus makes food for everyone out of just a few fish and a few loaves of bread. And they've already been through this, so Jesus is like, "Why? You guys, come on. We've already had this happen, and I took care of it. Just calm down. It'll be all right." Okay? Now, What's important there are 2 things that I want to hit on. The first is, when the disciples keep panicking when stuff like this, they don't get it. They don't understand who Jesus is. But who does understand who Jesus is? And there's 2 groups. The first is the people who are arranging themselves against Jesus. The Pharisees, the scribes, they get it because they are threatened by him. So they are putting together the pieces, ironically, a little bit faster than the disciples. The other is the ultimate enemy of Jesus, and that is in Satan. You remember at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, where does Satan take him? Out into the desert to be tempted for 40 days. Why? Because Satan knows what's going to happen, and he knows it's not going to be good for him. So he has to make any last-ditch attempt that he can to try to defeat Jesus. It's kind of like when you're in a battle, and you know that you're going to lose, but do you just give up your arms and quit fighting? Hopefully not. You still fight to the end. Even if we're in the context of like my 5th and 6th grade basketball team, if we're down by 10 in the fourth quarter, which if you've ever watched a 5th and 6th grade basketball game, 10-point gulf is like between here and Wisconsin. Do the kids just give them the ball and say, "Here you go score some more"? No. You still fight. So these 2 groups of people know who Jesus is. They know who he is. And they know, well, at least Satan knows, that he will lose. But he is still trying to make that fight anyway. But the disciples, they just don't always get it. And remember that they are common people, that the Pharisees would have been more educated in the Scriptures and would have had a better working knowledge of the Scriptures than the disciples would have at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Now, the other thing that I want to bring your attention to is verse 18. Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? Wouldn't it be grand if right after he says, don't you guys have eyes to see, and then we encounter someone who can't see? Well, guess what? We do. Okay, this is one of those times where Jesus is setting up his disciples for what's to come. Art has a question or a comment.
Isn't Jesus referring back to one of the Psalms where the false idols are having eyes but do not see, and mouths but do not speak, and or breathe, and noses but they do not smell?
Yes, he is going back to Psalms, and there's a passage in Isaiah that this references as well. I remember seeing it as I was preparing for today, but I can't tell you what it is off the top of my head. But yes, he is definitely referring back to the Old Testament scriptures with this statement. Pastor Hebner has his hand in the air.
Yeah, Vicar mentioned that Bible passage, and we did find that in Isaiah chapter 6. This is the call of Isaiah. Remember where the angel touched his lips with a hot coal and commissioned him? Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And Isaiah said, here am I, send me. And then here's his assignment. Go tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull, and close their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. So that's a quote from the commissioning of Isaiah, especially to preach the law to God's people and show them how spiritually blind and deaf they are. It's interesting that Jesus alludes to that in this context here. So great perception by Art and good observation by you.
All right. See, I was nervous about him bailing me out, and he did. So, thank you, Pastor. All right. So let's read what the leader guide had to say, and that'll kind of sum up what we've been discussing here for the past few minutes. That Jesus reminded the disciples that they had already seen miracles. Twice they had seen Jesus feed crowds with a small amount of food, but here again they worry about food. They were slow to understand Jesus and his power. All right, let's read verses 22 through 24, and then this is going to be the setup for the miracle itself. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." So, a couple of things to remember. First, they're coming from Capernaum to Bethsaida, which if you're going to do the old Wisconsin thing, if you live in Wisconsin, you have the privilege of being like, "Where are you from?" And you put up your hand like this, and you go, "Well, I'm kind of from here," and you just get about 2 hours from here to here. So if we're looking at the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum is kind of they're both on the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee, and they're not that far away. So between Bethsaida and Capernaum is not that great of a distance. But remember that as Jesus is traveling, he already has gained a reputation as a healer. And as is true today, was still true thousands of years ago, that if you do something extraordinary, either good or bad, your reputation precedes you. So they know and they have heard who Jesus is, and he has a reputation of the healer. I know Pastor has talked about the episode on Little House of the Prairie where the healer comes to the village. Why did he draw such a crowd? Because he had a reputation that went before him. People were expecting something extraordinary. And the same is true here. Now, this is the first recorded healing of a blindness in Mark. It is obviously not the first healing that Jesus has done, but it is going to be the first healing of blindness that's recorded in Mark's gospel. If we look at the question number 2, who came to Jesus? This was a group of people who brought a man to him, and what did they want? They wanted him to heal him. So this gives you an insight to both what they understand of Jesus as his reputation precedes him, but also this requires a degree of faith, right? This is not something where, we were kind of disappointed last year because the NCAA tournament was going to come to St. Louis, and we were all excited. I was going to get tickets for the kids. We were going to go take the kids to go see a college basketball game, and it got canceled because of the pandemic. It was right in the beginning when everything shut down. And that would have been a case where the reputation of we're going to go see a good basketball game or two would have been based on facts, right? This would have been something that you could go back and look at the statistics for the teams. You could go watch some of the previous matchups. You would know that you're going to see a good game, but you're not taking it on faith. You know that statistically you've got a really good shot at seeing something that's going to be exciting. This is a little bit different because this is beyond what would be normally possible. So this is beyond the scope of a normal encounter. So you've got a degree of faith that's going into their encounter with Jesus as well. Now, a couple of notes in chapter 1 and 3. These are the other encounters where Jesus has healed people in St. Mark's gospel. So those two kind of are, if you're reading the whole thing through, that sets you up for what is to come. And also, Jesus has this idea of healing by touch. This is a common theme in Mark's gospel as well. This happens 3 other times at least before this encounter that Jesus has healed someone through physical touch. Now, obviously, Jesus has the power to, snap his fingers and do whatever he pleases, but this is a way for him to physically make a connection with someone. Have you guys ever? Is there anyone in here who's a Star Trek fan? So I'm going to make a reference, but it's pretty nerdy. Okay, so you got to bring back your Wayback Machine to 1996. It's Star Trek First Contact, and they're in the missile silo against the warp ship that used to be an ICBM, and excuse me, Captain Picard has heard of this thing through his childhood. It's part of the historical mythology when you get to the 24th century of this historic thing that's about to happen. So what's the first thing that he does when he goes and actually sees the warp ship that used to be an ICBM? He just stands there and touches it. Doesn't say anything. He just stands there and touches it. And Data's confused because he's an android. He's like, "What, Captain, what are you doing?" And he's like, This is a connection between this object and me. I've always dreamt of this moment, but now I can feel it. It's visceral. It's real. And that's the same thing that Jesus is doing. He's making a physical connection to somebody. It's the same reason that a little kid, when they're upset, comes up and hugs your leg, because they're looking for some sort of physical touch. Okay, so let's read the Reader's Guide, and then we will move on to question 3. A group of people came to Jesus, bringing a blind man to him. They begged Jesus to touch this man. Here, as in many of Jesus' miracles, they did not specifically ask for a miracle, but they simply asked for Jesus' touch. They trusted that he would do what was best for this person. So let's move on to number 3. What did Jesus do for this man, and why do you think he acted in this way? Now, let's take this. Let's take a couple parts of these and break it down a little bit. So let's first remember that they are outside of the crowd. This happened in Mark chapter 7 as well. This is where the other time that the person who is being healed is taken out of the crowd before being healed. And then Jesus spits on the man's eyes, puts his hand on him, and then says, "Do you see anything?" And then this is sort of not what you expect, right? But there's a couple of reasons that he asks the person to see anything. The first of all is that not every round. This is not a healing that you could see from the outside. Sorry, I talk with my hands, and I'm going to get myself into trouble. This is not a miracle that you could see from the outside. You want to think of like when Jesus healed the 10 lepers. That leprosy would have been their skin would have been covered with sores. So this is something that people would have been able to see. Remember, Jesus says, go to the high priest, because the high priest will look at them and see they are healed. But unfortunately, we're not telepathic, which, as my 8th graders used to say, that's telepathetic. So there's your dad joke for the day, too. But because the people can't see, Jesus asks him and says to express whether he has been healed or not. So when Jesus asks him, and the man says, "I see." I lost my spot. He says that he sees things moving around like trees. Okay, well, this may seem unusual at first until, well, now you all look like trees. The pastor, last week had his reading glasses. I've got the opposite problem. I am quite nearsighted. If you have good vision, you can see the thickness of these lenses here. But to me, if I take these off, you guys are all just a bunch of blobs of color. There's nothing that I can see. In fact, when I was a kid, my aunt, who now lives in Sweden, has sort of the same vision as I do. So the trick to finding out whether we had enough trees on the light at my grandma's house would be my aunt and I would stand about 15 feet away and see if there were any holes in the big blob. And if there were any holes in the big blob, it'd say like, it's sort of about halfway down on the right. And then he'd look like, oh yeah, there is a spot there where there needs some more lights. So when you're saying I looked around like trees, those of you who are nearsighted, you can take your glasses off and relate to that. Any other questions about this particular area of the story? Art.
Does this mean the miracle wasn't quite taken yet? Jesus had to do something else?
Well, he's going to do something else. So you are. That is an excellent segue into the next question, and that's a really good question. Did Jesus' miracle just not take? Was he showing him love by doing this twice? We're going to hopefully get into a little bit of that, but unfortunately, I don't have a final answer for you in the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire kind of way, because it's not told us specifically. All right, so let's take a look at the leader guide answer for number 3, and then we'll move on. We'll read verses 25 and 26, and then we will take a look at the next question. So when the people asked Jesus to touch the blind man, Jesus took him by the hand and led him out of the village away from the people. He offered the man privacy. Then Jesus spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him. This might seem like a strange thing to do, but remember, the blind man could not see what Jesus was doing. Jesus dealt with the man in a sensory way. Jesus healed the man. At first, his vision was blurred. He saw people, but they looked like walking trees. He saw the shapes, but not the detail. We don't know how he reacted to this, but remember, he now had some vision. So let's look at verses 25 and 26. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." So, let's take a look at number 4. Jesus was not done helping this man. What did the Lord do next, and what was the result of his action? Now, this is a unique thing, this sort of do-over in the miracle. This doesn't happen anywhere else. And the difference between being, and there are 3 parallel kind of phrases in here that indicate his sight has been restored, but the most specific is the substitution of the word in Greek. The word in Greek for seeing is blepo. And there's a word, a diablepo, which means to either have an expression like your eyes wide open or to intensely stare at something, but it also has the connotation of being able to see clearly. So the substitution of these 2 words is what gives us this indication that his eyesight is restored perfectly. It's like when you go to the eye doctor for the first time and put your new pair of glasses on and the world has opened up. I can tell you, I experienced this firsthand because when I was a kid, I was about as nearsighted as I am now, but I didn't realize it was not normal, so I never said anything to my parents. In fact, the only way that my parents found out was I got my first F in 3rd grade because we had to do one of these 50 states tests. Okay, so the teacher puts the number in each state and put it on an overhead projector. A little blast from the past there too. Put it on an overhead projector and put it up on the screen. And I raised my hand and said, Mrs. Turk, I can't see. And she said, okay. So she moved me up to the front row. And then I said, Mrs. Turk, I still can't see. And she said, no, you can see. You're just yanking my chain. You just didn't study. So I got an F. I only got whatever I could guess right. And then we went to the eye doctor, and turned out I wasn't lying, I really couldn't see. So the first time they gave me glasses, I had no idea what the world looked like, because as far as I could remember back, everything was just sort of blobs. You kind of squint to make it out, and that was just how I knew life. So the first time they put a pair of glasses on me, it was literally like a whole new world. You get this idea of seeing clearly throughout this verse. Now, when we get to the end of verse 26, where Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't go to the village." Now, this is the way it's set up is sort of to parallel the other times that Jesus has either told people not to tell anyone about the miracle that has just happened to them, or even what he tells to Peter at the end of the Transfiguration account, which is the second part of this study today, where he says, "Don't tell anyone who I am." When Peter asks him, when Jesus asks him, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter confesses, "You are the Christ," and Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone yet." Okay, because he's letting his work speak for itself. One other scholar suggests that this, his name is Gundry, suggests that the man's going home rather than going back to the village is going to be a testimony in itself, because remember, there was no social security or social safety net, so anyone who was blind would have, unless they had a family to take care of them, they would have ended up begging. So the very fact that he will not return to the village and resume his position as a beggar is a testimony to the nature of the miracle itself, that he is going to be restored and going to be able to live a productive life instead of one of a beggar. So there's this sort of idea that while Jesus is not pronouncing to everyone who he is earning that reputation that precedes him through what he has done. Okay? So let's read the leader guide answer to this question, and then this is a rather short one, and then we'll get on to the next question. It just says, Jesus again put his hands on the man's eyes, and as a result of Jesus' touch, the man could see clearly. All right. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we read the next section and move on to Peter's confession of who Jesus is? All right. Well, thankfully, the tornado warning passed 20 minutes ago, and we're all still here, so we can continue on in our study. So verses 27 through 33. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man." So let's back up to verses 27 through 30. And then, this is kind of a three-part question that we have on number 5. So let's cover each of these individually. What did Peter say about Jesus? How did Peter react when Jesus foretold his death? And what does this tell us? Now, this is sort of you know how you have a narrative arc in a story? You begin with the setting, and then you have the rising action, and then you have the climax, and then you have the falling action, and finally the resolution. This is, as part of Jesus' ministry, this is a watershed moment in his ministry, because this is the first time that he actually specifically says to his disciples, "Yes, I am the Christ." Remember that Christ is the term for Messiah, so he is confessing to the disciples, "I am the one. Don't tell anyone yet, because my work is going to speak for itself, but I am the one." Art, did you have a question or a comment?
Caesarea Philippi, Peter says you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus explains just what that Messiah is supposed to be like. And Peter's confused because he had a different kind of Messiah in mind.
Yeah. And that would be fitting with their setting, right? Because they are an occupied people. So your immediate thought of someone who's going to save us is, right, we're going to be delivered from the occupying force. And what good is someone who's dead? It's not very often that you actually make a martyr out of someone who then puts that course forward. Most of the time, when you kill off the leader, you kill off the movement. Making a martyr of someone is the exception rather than the rule. So Peter says to Jesus, "You are the Christ," and then, as Art said, when Jesus tells Peter what that means, Peter says, "What? You've got to be nuts. There's no way that that's true. You can't die." Okay, and this shows us that he is, as Mark says, as Jesus says, you're not looking at it in the right way. You're thinking about it in too small of terms. Okay? As you might hear the phrase, you're missing the forest for the trees. Okay? He's he's hearing what Jesus has said he's going to do. And Peter's thinking to himself, you can't be the Messiah if you're going to die. You just can't. And Jesus is not only telling him, well, I'm not dying forever, I'm going to rise again. And Peter's saying, I just don't see it. Okay, he's focusing on what he would think is possible as a man. Now, remember, this is right after the time where they're traveling and they can't figure out how they're going to get more bread. So it seems like the same thing over and over and over again. Now, of course, we're looking at this with hindsight, okay, and seeing how all of these things build up together. The disciples didn't have all of that background knowledge, so it's fair to give them a little bit of a break. But, as we said at the beginning, you can't let them off the hook completely because his enemies know, his enemies have figured it out, and Satan has figured it out. So it shouldn't be beyond the scope of understanding that Jesus is the Messiah. So, I want to also go back to what they say that he is. Perhaps he is one of the prophets. Now, wouldn't you happen to know it, that what happens right after this? The Transfiguration. So Jesus ends up with two of the great prophets from the Old Testament, right? So as they're saying, you are a prophet. Now, remember, this wouldn't be the first time that prophets would have had what we would consider to be superhuman powers. There were other prophets who, and even some of the disciples, who could do things like cast out demons in the name of God. So this healing would not have been unprecedented for a prophet to do. But remember, as we talked about if you watched the Sunday Bible study, there are the three offices of Christ, the three jobs of Christ: prophet, priest, and king. So yes, so it's not a and or, it's a yes. So is he a prophet? Yes, certainly. He brings the word of God to people. Is that the only thing that he is? No. He is also the great high priest and the ruler of the reign of God. So let's read the leader guide of this, and then let's move on to the next question. I've got one more thing to add after the leader guide, because I want to put a modern context, an application to our modern context on this. Sorry, I can't talk today. Leader guide says, Peter said that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. Peter seemed to understand who Jesus was, but when Jesus explained he was going to die and rise again, Peter objected. He did not want Jesus to die. By saying this, Peter demonstrated that he didn't really understand Jesus' purpose for coming to earth and the means for accomplishing this purpose, his suffering and death on a cross. And one of the other things that one of the commentaries I was reading found something that I thought that was insightful in a modern connection, and that a lot of people, this is how we see Jesus now. If you're outside of the church, right? People will say, yeah, Jesus was a good teacher. He said a lot of the right things, but he's not God. Okay, that's sort of what we're dealing with here. So this is something that as Christians we still need to witness to people today, that Jesus wasn't just a great teacher. He wasn't just someone who taught morality. He is the true Son of God, the Messiah who came here with a purpose, knowing what he needed to do to forgive the sins of the world. And just like the disciples, a lot of people to this day don't understand that significance of his ministry, that purpose that has eternal consequences. All right, so let's read chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. This is the Transfiguration account. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes were dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Now, we're not going to spend we could do an entire study, or maybe even a couple of days on just the transfiguration. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to kind of move more quickly through the transfiguration itself and kind of talk about its implications as part of the miracles that are in this account that we're reading for today. So let's look at number 6. What did Peter, James, and John later see on the mountain? Well, they saw Moses, Elijah, and the glory of God. Now, this has tremendous implications for who Jesus is, because remember, this happens 6 days after Peter confesses him to be the Christ. So right as the disciples start understanding, Jesus shows them. So remember how Jesus' reputation has preceded him, and you had to go with a degree of faith. Now, Peter, James, and John have gotten a glimpse of the glory of God. Now, they will still need to have faith in what Jesus is going to do, but they now have seen who he is. Now, let's take a look at the leader guide answer for this, and then we're going to move on to the final connect section. Just says, 6 days after the healing, Jesus led Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. On the mountain, they saw Jesus in his glory and heard the voice of God the Father calling Jesus his beloved Son. Okay, are there any questions or comments about this section of the study? Pastor Whitbear.
You can't answer this, but I want to know how Peter knew who Moses and Elijah were.
Indeed. If you couldn't hear online, Pastor Whitbear said, I don't know that you can answer this, but I want to know how Peter knew who Moses and Elijah were, and I'd like to know that too. Yeah, one of those little stickers that says, "Hello, my name is." Stick that on your tunic, and as you come down to see the glory of God. Indeed, that sounds like one of those things you can add to your list to ask Jesus when you get there. And I don't know about you, but my list is getting longer as I get older. So let's take a look at the connect section. So number 1, it says, at first glance, it might seem that Jesus' healing was initially ineffective. It took 2 steps to heal this man. How does the way he performed this miracle actually demonstrate kindness and mercy? So, how many of you guys have ever stepped into a shower that was much too hot? I know I have. Or on the other side, much too cold. Yeah? Okay, I know I've done that. Or, you go swimming and you jump into a lake and it's suddenly about 15 degrees cooler than you thought it was going to be, and that's a shock to your system, right? Okay, well, that's kind of the same thing that's going on here with this man who was blind. It's a way that Jesus showed his kindness to this man because he's never seen before. So this is going to be a shock to his system. Okay, so you could even think about this if you've ever had a spouse or a roommate, if you're in the middle of the night and they have to get up for work, and instead of using a flashlight or they just turn on all of the lights. Have you ever have that happen to you? Man, my dad, when I was in high school, my bedroom was in the basement and it had no windows. So it was pitch black in that room. And he would sometimes forget that the switch to the basement turned on all of the lights, including the ones in my room. So sometimes at like 5:30, he would go to like feed the cat or whatever, and he turned the light on, and bam! From pitch darkness, all the lights are on, and I was like, ah! And of course, as a teenager, I can tell you I handled it in the most mature of manners, right? Yes. Okay, so that was a shock. So whenever you are accustomed to not being able to see light, and all of a sudden you have all of this coming in, it's a way to gradually adjust his new vision. So this is a form of mercy and kindness that Jesus is showing this man. All right, let's go to connect number 2. Jesus actually performed 2 miracles in this text. How is the healing of the blind man related to the story of the disciples? So I want you to think about this in terms of being gradually revealed. Okay, so in the blind man, as he's healed, it's not immediate. It's a gradual, first he sort of sees everything around, like if you're nearsighted without glasses, and then his sight is restored completely. In the same way, Jesus has been making himself known to the disciples. But he didn't say in Mark chapter 2, hey guys, guess what? I am the Messiah, right? It's me. Pay attention to me. It's all about me, right? That's not what he did. Okay? Instead, he let his work speak for itself. And then when they came to the conclusion, and he says, Peter, who do people say I am? And they go through the list, and he's, okay, well, who do you think I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. You're the Christ. And Jesus is like, good. Gold star for you today. Until then, he messes it up a couple of verses later. But you know, sometimes you got to take it when it comes, and just take your win when you get it. Okay, so Jesus is gradually revealing himself to be the Son of God. And as soon, 6 days after Peter confesses he's the Christ, you get a much more intense view of who Jesus is. Now, I can't speak to this with complete authority, but I would postulate that this is not a coincidence. That Jesus reveals his full glory after Peter has confessed that he is the Christ. Okay, this is not something that I could write in a term paper in class or anything, but I would be willing to go out on a limb and say, I think that this is intentional. Okay, so let's go to connect number 3. The disciples were slow to understand who Jesus was and what he was doing. How are we like them, and what does it take for us to understand? And that we are often like his disciples. We often don't do the right thing. We often say the wrong thing, and sometimes we even doubt who Jesus is. And yet, Jesus is still patient with us, right? He's still, regardless of how many times we forsake him, regardless of how many times we abandon him, he still welcomes us back into his arms. Okay, and this is one of the things that's unique about our God. You look at all these other religions around the world, it's all about how you make your way to either their God or some spiritual nirvana. It's all through, you have to do it. And if you don't, there are consequences to that. Our God is different. Regardless of how many times we don't do the right thing, he still opens his arms back for us. Don, do you have a question or a comment?
I'm thinking, why would these things? It's kind of like what Peter said, I think, or Paul said this, it's called Satan. We do the things that we don't want to do, and we don't do the things that we should do. And that's because of Satan.
Yes, Paul. Yep, that was Paul.
That maybe the disciples didn't get when he fed the 5,000 and 4,000. He had something to work with. Now he has nothing to work with, and he just, there's also a lie by that actually maybe got ceased. And that's what Paul did his suicide process. They didn't really realize it because he really had done a miracle.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the very beginning of this reading, right? That they're panicking about what to do about the food situation. That indicates that, as you said, they haven't fully put their faith in him, right? There must have been, we're not sure how he did it, but he must have had a way. But like you said, there were already loaves and fish to work from. What if that doesn't exist? Can you still do it? So I think that's a good observation. All right, so let's take a look at the final section, the vision section. It says on your guide, the disciples were slow to understand Jesus' teaching. They wanted the glory, but not the suffering. They wanted Jesus to teach and do miracles, but not to die on a cross. They were slow to understand, but gradually Jesus opened their eyes and showed them his plan. So the question number one, what would have happened if Peter had gotten his way? Well, like any child who says, if you're a kid, what do you want to eat for breakfast every day? Candy. What do you want to eat for lunch every day? Candy. What do you want to eat for dinner every day? Oh, I've had candy. Let's have chips for dinner, right? I've already had sweet, so let's do something salty. Okay? Would you be in heaven for those 3 meals? Yes. Well, I would anyway. I can tell you, of these 7 deadly sins, mine is gluttony. If I could just sit and eat chips and watch TV for a whole day, I'd be in hog heaven. So anyway, and my waistline reflects that. So Jesus wants all of the good stuff, but none of the bad stuff. And just like a kid who wants to eat candy and chips for meals, it's nice while it's there, but that undermines, in that case, it undermines your health, right? What's going to happen? You're going to have a 7-year-old with diabetes, and not through any sort of genetic issue. You'll have a 7-year-old who has diabetes because of what they've been eating. So in the same way, Jesus, this is part of the plan. And if Peter got his way, the plan couldn't happen. And we would all be in dire straits because Jesus knew what he had to do when he came to the world. And if you want all the good stuff without any of the hardship, you'd end up with nothing. This is a hard thing that I taught middle school for 10 years before leaving the teaching ministry. And this is a hard thing for even middle schoolers to understand, that you need to put in hard work. The best rewards that you get are from hard work, not just receiving it, right? And what Jesus knows, that in order to take all of the sin upon himself, that's not going to be the fun part of his ministry. It's going to be agonizing. It's going to be brutal. But that's also that measure of love, that knowing that he still takes that on. Okay, so let's go to number 2. Like the disciples, our lack of understanding, our lack of faith, or our own desires often blind us. How can we keep these things from happening? Well, one of the ways you can do that is what we're doing right now, spending time in his word. Okay, keeping as they used to say in the civil rights movement, your eyes on the prize. Okay, making sure that your desires and what you are looking for are consistent with what God tells us. And the other is what we talked about this weekend in the sermon, right? The sacraments. Bringing God's word through a physical element to us on Sunday morning, partaking of the Lord's Supper. When you are a baby or a small child or an adult, receiving the waters of baptism. Those are ways that our faith is created and sustained. All right, that is the final question on our sheet. So we've accomplished our mission for today, hopefully. Does anyone have any closing questions or comments? All right, seeing none, let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the inspiration of your word. We give you thanks for the time that we are together to be able to spend time in your word. And we give you thanks for the technology for those who are not present with us to be able to study your word with us. Bless us as we go about our business today. Help us to keep our eyes on you, and we invite and for you to sustain our faith and grow our faith so that we can be even closer to you. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you are in person, thank you for being here today. If you are watching online on our Facebook feed, thank you for joining us. And if you are listening through our telephone ministry, thank you for being there as well. We wish you God's blessings upon your day. Don't forget that we are have our midweek Lenten series, Eyes on Jesus, that will be here at 2:15 in the sanctuary and online. You can register to be here in person. That will also be rebroadcast at 7 o'clock in the evening. And we invite you to join us for Sunday morning worship and Bible study this weekend as well. Thank you for being here today. God's blessings upon the rest of your day.